A coordinated attack on Syria's chemical weapons sites, launched by the US, UK and France in retaliation for a suspected chemical attack on Douma that killed more than 40 people. The US wants to put diplomatic clout behind the strikes and says it will go after Russia for enabling Syria's use of chemical weapons.
So you will see that Russian sanctions will be coming down, and they will go directly to any sort of companies that were dealing with equipment related to Assad and chemical weapons use.
It will be the third round of sanctions from the Trump administration against Russian companies and individuals in the past 4 weeks. The White House says it's to punish Russian oligarchs who are profiting from the Kremlin's destabilizing activities. Since the first round of sanctions were implemented in March, Russia's biggest companies have lost a lot of their market value, with aluminium producer Rouble one of the biggest losers. Its shares have fallen 74% since then. The ruble, meanwhile, has lost 10% of its value against the US dollar. But Moscow says it won't hesitate to retaliate. Politicians are preparing legislation to give the Kremlin the powers to ban US imports.
This bill includes a ban or partial ban on agricultural goods, raw materials, and goods manufactured in the US, including alcohol and tobacco.
Russia is the US's 23rd biggest trading partner, so it's unlikely that retaliatory sanctions will have any impact on the American economy. Liz Maddock, TRT World.
For more on the possible US sanctions against Russia, let's go to Paris, and joining us from there is our editor-at-large, Craig Copetas. Hello, Craig. Great to have you with us again. Look, the sanctions against Russia, they could have major consequences for Russian companies, but the impact could be far wider, couldn't it?
Well, the impact, it's not woulda, coulda, shoulda. It's happening right now. You talked about Rouble, which is the largest producer of primary aluminum in the world, with 3 smelting refineries in Europe owned by Rouble. They get their bauxite from a company called Rio Tinto down in Australia in a kind of a joint venture deal. Over the weekend, Rio Tinto did something that you rarely see in the commodity world. They triggered what's called a force majeure, which is basically a legal mechanism that says all contracts they have with suppliers, producers, etc., are null and void. And the reason you trigger a force majeure are 2 reasons. One, it's a natural disaster. The second reason is war, because Rio Tinto now doesn't want to do business with Russia, because if they do, like many other companies, they too will face sanctions, fines, and possible jail time in the United States.
Now, one of the possible avenues that the US has is to possibly go after Russia's banks. If it does that, what is the possible blowback on the energy sector?
Well, as they already are going after the banks indirectly through the various directors of some of the banks and some of the Russian and foreign companies that do business. But here is where the law of unintended consequences smacks you in the face. About 40% of all of Europe's energy comes from Russia, and there's a new pipeline coming through with it. What happens when Europe goes to pay the bill for that energy? If the banks accept that money, they could be in violation of US and EU sanctions. And no one has laid this out in front of the politicians yet to ask what could happen. Banks right now do not want to deal with Russia. You're seeing it across the board and across the world.
Presumably, if that happens, Russia could very simply say, well, we're going to stop supplying gas to Europe, right?
Absolutely, because, you know, the way the Kremlin operates, the way Putin operates, he's been in business for 18 years, including his regency with Medvedev. You know, all threats to Russia, Putin says, are external threats. They're foreign threats to Russia. And the Russian people should be heroic and put up with them. That's how Russia works, like it or not. So they cut it off, and there's a real Cold War. And the fact of the matter is is that the Russians can stand the cold of a winter a lot better than the people of Europe who are getting that natural gas and other energy.
Perversely, though, before we potentially get to a new Cold War, some of what's going on now, and potentially sanctions, could actually be quite good for Russian oil companies specifically. Explain how that might work.
Well, it might work because their production costs are cheaper, but they need equipment from the West, and they're not going to be able to buy it, you know. And I think this whole thing, if you go back a year ago, and we started talking about how the U.S. was weaponizing the dollar against various countries and industries, you know, people took it seriously, but they didn't take it very seriously. Now, a year later, they're taking it extremely seriously. Because, and I go back to this concept of a force majeure. Companies do not trigger force majeures unless it's the last resort. So for one of the world's largest metal trading outfits, mining operations, Rio Tinto, to trigger a force majeure over aluminum, one of the most used, most important products in the world, is a major event.
OK, we're going to have to leave it there. Craig Copetas in Paris, thank you very much indeed.